We are not simply aiming to map the developing network of roads and waterways over a century and a half from the early years of the English Renaissance, but to use such development as an indicator of economic, industrial and demographic change. We want to discover how, where, when and to what extent the nation was industrializing in the centuries before the so-called Industrial Revolution. And we want to determine what factors influenced the likelihood of a settlement to develop into a commercially successful town. By 1628, according to the leading lawyer Edward Coke, a legal principle had been established whereby not only the old major Roman ways, but also all of the roads between market towns were regarded as Viae Regiae, or the King's highways, as rights of way not only by foot or on horseback, but with carts too. And so these Viae Regiae between market towns are indicative of trade routes, as are all public navigable rivers. Their fall into disuse, their obstruction, complaints of their ruin through overuse, and the replacement of fords and ferries with bridges are all indicative of changing trading patterns, urbanization, and changes in industrial and agricultural production. But tracing the course of these cartways after centuries of enclosure, turnpiking, and canal and railway construction is no simple task. Take, for example, the King's Path at Fordham, so named by 1410, which John Ogilby showed through great lanes of corn or open arable on the route from Ely to Bury St Edmunds. So you can get your bearings, here's Fordham Bridge. This small section of one of Ogilby's 100 strip map plates gives only a flavour of the kinds of historical and economic data that can be extracted. He shows two watercourses, Fordham Church lying to the north of what was then the main road. The hall, I imagine, is what remained at that time of Fordham Priory, later reincarnated as Fordham Hall, due south of Fordham. And Ogilby also shows, without comment, two windmills. By the end of the 19th century, the King's Path led to nowhere, and yet it still remains visible from the sky. The navigability of waterways is also somewhat unknown. It's generally held that until the early 17th century, their use had been declining for hundreds of years due to their obstruction by mill dams and fish weirs, but there's been no systematic collection of local evidence to locate and quantify the disruption in a regional or national perspective. The complaints of obstructed navigation may in some cases have arisen from increased demand from boats carrying larger cargoes rather than from any new obstruction. There is so much we don't know, but we have a pretty good idea of the state of the transport network's evolution by 1680, as illustrated on our puntastic cartograph, which is already live on our website. Here I've made a rough sketch of the roads surveyed by Ogilby and mapped by him and Philip Lee a few years later. As for understanding how the road network reached that state, there's a great deal of evidence online and offline in national repositories and in local and private archives, which a large-scale public history drive could collect and collate. Our plan is to work systematically through this evidence, geolocating events and features and pinning them to a timeline. We've already made a start by mapping a variety of small data sets, including port surveys from 1565, a 1636 list of taverns, and a list of carters indicted in the 1620s for having too many wheels on their wagons. And this is how we plan to do it. We'll create a geographic framework, a gazetteer, which in the model we're adopting, developed by Karl Grossner for the World Historical Gazetteer, is a list of geographic features with details of their existence, location and condition over time, citing and ideally linked to source references. Features might be varied, but in our case will be predominantly settlements, navigable rivers, road segments, and water crossings such as bridges, fords and ferries. The precise course of road and river segments might have varied or become more defined over time, and our gazetteer will be able to record those changes. Settlements may have been granted market charters or ceased to exploit old ones. They might be incorporated, giving them certain economic powers, or they might have their incorporation revoked. The closure of monasteries at the end of the 1530s probably had significant effects on local economies, but apart from a really interesting study led by Leander Heldring, there have been few systematic attempts to quantify such effects, which might range from the establishment of new industries within former monastic premises to the neglect of bridges and causeways that monastic institutions once had a duty to maintain. Some monastic orders were duty-bound to provide accommodation for travellers, and the void created by their closure might not quickly be filled in a society where alehouses were strictly regulated by licence. James Cameron has completed the mapping of dissolved monasteries. An early observation made possible by our prototype mapping, shown here, is that those obliged to offer accommodation to travellers, shown here in red and pink, tended to be situated close to what were principal roads a century and a half later. Fortunately, we're not starting from scratch. The Geonames database is an enormous gazetteer of modern place names, but the inclusion of so many modern features makes it less than ideal for our purposes. A Welsh initiative was the forerunner of the GB 1900 project, which crowdsourced the extraction of place names from Ordnance Survey maps covering the whole of Great Britain in the period from 1888 to 1914. The Restr o Enwau Lleoedd Hanesyddol Gymru continues to collect place names from other sources, while the Historical Gazetteer of England's place names collates the work of the English Place Name Society that has been ongoing since 1923. Humphrey Southall has demonstrated how these sources can be brought together to illuminate early modern texts in his Vision of Britain website, which links gazetteers to the text of William Camden's Britannia. And there's a georeference database of medieval markets and fairs, which we might extend with reference to later charters and contemporary observations. We have agreed in principle a formal collaborative partnership with CAMPOP, the Cambridge Group for the History of Population and Social Structure. Over 50 years, they have produced a number of especially useful spatial datasets, including Max Satchell and Alan Rosevier's Road Network, based on maps resulting from John Ogilvy's survey conducted in the 1670s. The group also has datasets relating to towns and accommodation, but these are focused on the late 17th century, while our aim is to push back our collective detailed knowledge by 150 years or so. And there's an enormous volume of data recorded in that 150-year period between 1530 and 1680, which has never been collected and assimilated. Such data exists not only in the records generated by the state at the instigation of Lord Burleigh, which included the first detailed national mapping undertaken by Christopher Saxton and surveys of coastal settlements and customs ports. It exists also in the textual accounts of chorographers such as William Camden, developing the theme of Leland's local descriptions of the 1530s, and in the legal records of quarter sessions and probate registries. The quarter sessions recorded the issue of alcohol licenses, which are indicative of demographic demand, and details of highway defects. Probate registers recorded not only the decease of individuals active in the production and transport of agricultural and industrial goods, but also in inventories certain details of the geographic extent of their credit and debt networks. What is lacking is a unifying structure to allow ready visualization of the temporal, geographic and economic interrelationships between these data sets. So apart from our map, or rather as the engine behind our map, our project's key output will be the Gazetteer of Early Modern England and Wales, or EMU. I'll populate it initially with data that I've already extracted from Burley's coastal surveys and details of river crossings from various Tudor sources, including Saxton's maps. It will also incorporate a rough outline of the road and river network, the latter based on work by Elias Oksanen, which we will be able to refine as we gather more data, and some version of the other data sets I've already mentioned. Besides our partnership with Campop, our project is linked with Via Bundus, a project based in Germany which aims to map transport and mobility across Europe between 1350 and 1650. And we've also begun the process of forming a partnership with the Pelagios network, which exists to connect researchers, scientists and curators to link and explore the history of places. If you're not familiar with these people, I strongly encourage you to follow the links to their brilliant projects from our website. We also plan to establish an advisory board, but fundamental to all that follows is the development of a national network of expert volunteers, both public and academic, with detailed local knowledge.